Welcome to episode 28 of the LoraineCounty.com Business Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Ed Skimmon, and today we're talking with Kellie Deeter, candidate for the Ohio House of Representatives for the 54th District. Join us as Kellie talks about her journey from a nurse anesthesiologist to a political candidate, her dedication to healthcare reform, and her vision for rural healthcare, agricultural support, and energy needs. She also shares her insights on property tax reform, regulation, and business development. This episode is part of the 2024 Candidate Spotlight Series aimed at providing an additional way to learn about local leaders running for office. Before we get started, I wanted to share a quick disclaimer. Both of the companies I co-founded, Emerge Inc. and LoraineCounty.com, have professional relationships with some of the candidates, and I also count a few of them as personal friends. To ensure fairness, we invited all local candidates to participate and record an episode completely free of charge. Each candidate running for the same office was asked the exact same questions, and aside from removing any unnecessary sounds and long pauses, we kept the editing to a minimum. For a full list of local candidates and issues, visit LoraineCounty.com/election. And on election night, visit LoraineCounty.com for real-time election results. Here's my conversation with Kellie Deeter.
Kellie Deeter, and I am the Republican nominee for state representative for Ohio's 54th House District, which going forward, starting January 1st, will include the majority of Huron County, with the exception of Lyme and Wakeman Township, and all of western and southern Lorain County.
Welcome, Kellie. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights. Could we start with what motivated you to run for Ohio House of Representatives?
About 18 years ago, when I went into advanced practice nursing as a nurse anesthetist, I went directly into practice in a rural critical access hospital, and I found it to be challenging in terms of regulation. And I guess the easiest way to describe it would be in all facilities, whether rural or urban, you have to have the same patient outcomes, the same standard of care. But in a rural setting, you do it with less resources. And if you take into consideration regulation, sometimes you even have to do it with your hands tied behind your back. So that's when I became civically engaged and just tried to work with the Ohio legislature on some of the healthcare policy, just by bringing them in physically into the hospital and showing them what regulation translates to what in everyday practice and how that looks when we're actually trying to take care of patients. During over a several year period, I think like a 6 or 8 year period, I took over 80 legislators into an operating room in their district across the state of Ohio to show them specifically what our revised code, which was written in 1919, translates to today, over 100 years later, in an operating room setting, which in 1919 you can be certain that they did not predict how anesthesia or surgery was going to look in 2024. So updating revised codes is therefore important, but it is very difficult to grasp. As a legislator, you have to be an expert in everything, but that's obviously impossible. So they needed to see it. They needed to understand physically how revised code translates to patient care. So I did that. We were able to successfully update our revised code as a result of that in 2020, but it did take that entire decade to get that done. So at that point, I had failed, succeeded, and really through that, I learned the intricacies of policymaking very well. It's always good to fail first and then succeed. I think it's a lot of grit that obtained as a result. And after that experience, I should say through that experience, I became the government relations director for a healthcare trade association in Columbus, just through that grassroots effort. And after that was finished, I was faced with what do I do with all sort of knowledge and experience. If you would have asked me at that time if I was going to run for office or if my name would appear on a ballot, I probably would have given you a short and quick no. But then we're faced with an open house seat in my district. And you look around and see who's stepping up to serve in that role. There wasn't very much interest, to be honest. And I talked it over with the current state representative who will be vacating the seat due to term limits. And we decided that would be a viable option. And he encouraged me to do it. That's what initially motivated me.
Can you outline your main priorities if you're elected to the Ohio House of Representatives?
Once elected, I really want to lend my expertise wherever it's most helpful, and that's usually determined by the leadership. But obviously, I would assume that my expertise would be best lent in the healthcare field, so on the health committee. My district relies heavily on rural healthcare. I certainly think there is a lot more work to be done there, and I'd be happy to serve in that role in the legislature. But other priorities, my district relies on agriculture heavily, manufacturing, and outside of those two things specifically, every district needs energy needs addressed, cost efficient and available energy, as well as inflation, which is generally driven by national or federal issues, but we certainly need to see what we can do for Ohioans in that regard. And housing is a big issue, housing supply. Property taxes is a huge issue, especially for our older senior citizens. So I think those are really the biggest initiatives facing Ohio.
A large part of our audience is business owners and business managers. How would your election and the implementation of your priorities benefit local businesses?
So I'm also a business owner. I own an anesthesia company that services hospitals and surgery centers with anesthesia staffing. So I certainly am familiar with budgeting and payrolls and things like that. I was endorsed by the Ohio Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business as well. I'm not a big fan of regulation, as from what I mentioned about healthcare regulation in terms of business also. I think we can also keep that to a minimum. Specifically, I would work with those stakeholders to see if there was any initiatives that would directly affect businesses, but certainly a simpler and lowest possible tax structure is always helpful to business. Less mandates, less regulation. Honestly, though, healthcare, when I talk to businesses, healthcare is their number one complaint. So affordable, accessible healthcare.
What role do you see technology and innovative practices playing in the future of the Ohio House of Representatives office and your district?
AI is all the discussions now and how we're going to see that both contribute and possibly even be harmful for businesses. Healthcare is going to be using AI in a lot of ways to simplify things. But each individual business, I'm not certain how it would be helpful. Happy to look into it and regulate it as needed or write legislation if necessary. But I'm a limited government person. I think that we should look to them to guide our policy on tech-related issues.
If elected, how would you define success? What metrics will you use to measure your progress towards this success?
Talking to voters, seeing what they need, hopefully passing legislation that does good for the majority, and that is going to look different for every district. If I'm able to pass legislation to make healthcare more affordable, more accessible, that's my number one goal. My second highest priority goal would be property tax reform, and we're already looking at all of these things and seeing, what we can do on January 1st to hit the ground running and hopefully be successful. If we pass legislation for property tax reform in the first 6 months of 2025, that would be one goal met and one metric that we've set for ourselves and what we call our freshman class. So those of us entering this coming January, that would be the main thing. I would say energy would be a longer term goal. And if we can get something done the next General Assembly in terms of our energy goals long term, I think that would be successful. Correct.
Let's switch over and talk a little bit about you. What's your background? I know you said you run a small business.
Yes, I am 50 years old. I've lived and worked in Huron County all of my life. I am the wife of a 27-year Army veteran, mother to 6 children between the ages of 12 and 25. I am a small business owner. I own an anesthesia company. Education background includes a doctorate in nursing practice. I practice as a nurse anesthesiologist and a nurse practitioner both, mostly as a nurse anesthesiologist, and our company supplies anesthesia staffing to hospitals and surgery centers throughout Ohio. I still do practice as well just to maintain proficiency in anesthesia. And since I'm not trying to make a career out of politics, I will certainly want to go back to doing that full time at some point. And for the last decade, I have been the government relations director for the Ohio State Association of Nurse Anesthetists.
In your professional career, what are you most proud of accomplishing?
Definitely passing the law that updated the scope of practice for nurse anesthetists back in 2020. So that was a monumental effort, and that is definitely, in my career, that's what I'm most proud of. Obviously, my overall life, my family, the success of my business, and my children.
Outside of work, what are your hobbies and interests, and how do they help recharge you?
Generally attending my kids' events. About the only thing we do outside of that is play golf every Sunday is in a couples league.
Last question. What else should voters know about you prior to voting in November?
Just that I will always be mindful of the voters in the district when making any policy decisions. I'm not there to serve myself in any way. Everyone asks what my agenda is. My agenda is the agenda of the district. So whatever the district needs, I'm not a radical in any way, shape, or form in any ideology. I am a Republican, so my beliefs prioritize fiscal discipline, prudent spending, limited government, and the lowest possible tax structure. But with that said, I'm for school choice, for example, but I'm also not going to turn my back on our public school system. I attended public school, and I think there is always places where we can agree on things, and I think that's where we start.
Finally, where can people get more information on your candidacy and connect with you?
So my website is kelliedeeter.com, and that has most information on there. There's not a list necessarily of everything that I stand for, because again, I stand for what the district stands for. But what I am willing to do at all times is correspond with any voter. They reach out to me on the website and it will come directly to me and I will respond. And I'm also happy to meet with any voter in the district at any time as well. I think those meetings are important because it gives much more context to just a bullet point of what you feel about a topic. I think topics are very nuanced and I think more context should be given than just a bullet point. That's somewhat important to me and I would encourage voters to reach out and meet with me.
Thanks, Kellie, for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the LoraineCounty.com Business Insights Podcast. We hope you found this conversation informative and that it provided some ideas that will help your business continue to grow. Please follow us on your favorite podcast platform to hear each episode where we shine a spotlight on local resources that will boost your business. And we want to hear from you. Email ed@LoraineCounty.com to share your feedback and topic ideas.